So now that we've gone over data entry, we've covered the entire left-hand side of the toolbar here. What I want to go over next is how to pull that data out of DonorQuest so that it's useful to you. And we call that creating a selection or creating a query. And to begin this process, what you need to do is click on the green and white question mark here on the toolbar. And this brings up the creating a selection dialog box where we have lots of different options. And we will go over all these different options before the end of this portion of the video presentation. But what I want to go over first here is the different types of selections that we can run in DonorQuest. So the most basic type is the range selection. So we're just going to check that, which is the default, and click OK. Now the range selection is pulling out data in a range in any of the fields that you can enter data in DonorQuest. So every single field that we went over where you can put in a value in DonorQuest, you can also run a query or search on. So what I want to do first is just run a really simple one to kind of give you a feel for how this works. And what I want to do is find all the donors in California. So the first thing you need to do is title your selection, because you'll see later when we come to the selection results area where all your selections are stored, they're all going to be listed there. And so if you ever want to go back and look at one, you'll need to title each selection so that you can find it in the spreadsheet where all these selections are stored. So I'm just going to name this selection All Donors in California. And once I've got a title in there, I just need to go down to the field which I'm interested in, which is the state field. That's where all your donors' state information is stored. So I'm going to highlight state and click Edit Range. And I'm going to pick the state that I want to choose. And so to do that, I'm going to type in the lower and upper value, the state code for California. And so what I'm telling the database to do is run through all the records in this sample database and pull out all the donors with the CA in their state field. Now the contains value we don't use very often. Instances where you would use that would be if you're searching for a keyword within the notepad of a donor, or perhaps you're searching for an organization name, and perhaps sometimes there's a the or an inc involved in the organization name, so you just want to grab out that one particular word that you're looking for. That's when you would use the contains value, so not very often. So for lower and upper value, we're going to enter the same value, then click OK, and then go ahead and hit Begin Selection. And what DonorQuest just did is it ran through all of the donors in the sample database, and it found 19 that had a state of California in their records. So their main address was in California. So now once we have the donors in a selection result, as we do here, there's lots of different things we can do with them. We can view the donors to actually verify our result. And here we have a list of the 19 donors that qualified. So if we click Edit, we should see that all these donors, in fact, do have an address in California. This donor does, from Palo Alto, and this donor is from Mount Shasta. And if we go through all of them, you'll see we'll have a state value of California. So now to go back to the spreadsheet where we just were, where those selection results were stored, we click back on the white spreadsheet here on the toolbar, which is the selection results window. Now we can also print reports, which we'll also get into more later during this demonstration in the next chapter. We can also print labels right from DonorQuest, Avery 5160 or 5161. You can also create custom labels if you use a type other than those two. You can export the data to, for example, Excel or Word. And these other buttons are a little bit more advanced, so we really won't go into these too much more during this demonstration. So we're going to go on to the next type of selection, which is total amount given for date range. Now this selection is really useful, especially when you're trying to find donors who have given a certain amount of money in a certain time range. So a common one is perhaps all donors who gave over $100 last calendar year. So here on this form, we're going to put in the from space, or the lower dollar amount, we're going to put in 100. We're going to leave all the nines there because we're not concerned if they gave an amount much over $100. We're just looking for donors that gave anything over $100. And the donation date, we're going to switch to last calendar year. Okay, over here on the right, you have an is one of and not one of column. So, for example, if you wanted to limit the donations or the people that we pick out to only donors who have given checks, you could, from the drop down here, you could choose just checks. Or if you were looking for just one particular stimulus or campaign code, you could choose that as well. Okay, but just for example purposes, we're just going to go ahead and hit begin. And in this little sample database, there were 2 donors that gave over $100 last calendar year. Okay, so I'm going to click close again and go back to the creating a selection icon again. And next, we're going to go over specific list codes and specific profile codes. Both these selections work the same, and they're very simple. So if you remember, the list codes were back during data entry on the constituency tab of a donor's record. It's the affiliation codes is another word for it, if they belong to a board or a committee, something of that nature. So we're just going to search for all board members. And from the list code drop down, I'm going to choose my board list. And you'll see there are 2 options here, include or exclude based on these codes. So if we wanted to get all the donors except the board members, we could choose exclude. But in this case, I am looking for the board members, so I'm going to include, and I'm going to hit begin selection. And in the sample database, there were 3. And the profile code selection works exactly the same, so we won't go over that. But if you remember, the profile codes are on the additional info tab, and there are just 5 of those. And those are we recommend you use for fundraising interests the donor might have. Okay, there's also a duplicate record check built into DonorQuest. So if you have several different people entering data in DonorQuest, it's a good idea to run this once a month. Basically, it will go through and find or flag possible duplicates in DonorQuest, which you can then consolidate if you so choose. Okay, custom selection are just some pre-built selections that we've put into the program for convenience. And there's a whole list of them here. A lot of them we built for customers over the years and just left them in this area because they're handy for lots of our client base. So here's one that I think a lot of development directors like. Birthdays coming up in the next week. So if you store your birthdays or birth dates of your donors in DonorQuest, you can run this selection every week and then find out which of your donors have birthdays coming up, and you can send them a nice little card. So if you scroll through here, there's lots of useful selections. For example, new donors year to date. And all you have to do with these selections is just highlight it and then hit begin. So it's quite simple, and that's why a lot of these selections, which normally would be quite complicated, are stored here. So now we've gone over all the different types of selections, so I want to go over the rest of this form really quickly. There's the selection source up here in the upper right hand corner. You'll very rarely have to deal with this. The donor dataset is your main dataset, so that's where all your active donors are stored. If you have the database for several years and it grows and you decide that maybe you want to archive some of your older donors that haven't given in, say, 5 years, you can move them to another dataset called the archive dataset to keep them separated and out of the way of your main active donors. But again, very rarely will you have to use this. It's really only used by large organizations that have had the system for quite a while. So the source table here, this is quite important, and I just want to try to explain it as simply as I can. If you're going for donors and their mailing information, you're always going to leave the source table header. Header is the donor's name, address, biographical information, so the main information view where we enter their name, address, things of that nature, list codes. If you're looking for specific donations in DonorQuest for one stimulus or for just one particular year, you'll need to move the source table to donations. Or if you're looking for pledges for just one stimulus or between a certain date range, again, you will need to switch the source table to pledges. And you can see that these source table options reflect the different tables you have up here in the upper left for data entry. So most of the time you're only going to be dealing with header and donations. But again, to try to explain it as simply as I can, if you leave the source table header, the selection will focus on the donor's name and address, so you'll always use that for mailings. If you want a donation report, you're always going to have to choose donations. Okay, now over here in the lower left, if you remember earlier too during the demonstration, we went over some checkboxes where you could mark a donor inactive or bad address or do not solicit. So here is where you can exclude these donors right from the beginning of a selection. So if you're doing a selection for a mailing, you're most likely always going to want to check these boxes. So you take those donors out of the selection so that you don't waste postage on them. So that's it for selections. It's a general broad overview. And next we're going to move on to reporting.